Excellencies, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I've been invited to share with you the outcomes of a project that I've been working on with Canadian and Mongolian colleagues, which we hope will be of some use throughout the education systems of the Community of Democracies and beyond. The project was entitled Advancing Education for Democracy with the Community of Democracies. Its main purpose was to develop a curriculum on education for democracy which would be relevant to the member countries of the COD, as well as other countries interested in advancing democracy in and through education. The idea was to create a high-level framework on education for democracy that would provide suggestions on how we might infuse democratic content and principles into the various aspects of our education systems, and to inform the development of national curricula and educational policy. The project emerged from an idea presented by the Office of the COD Presidency and received funding through the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs. The project has been operational since August and will close later this month. Throughout its duration, Canadian and Mongolian experts have worked closely together through 2 working sessions and at a distance to develop what we hope will be a useful framework for advancing education for democracy throughout our school systems. First, I'll talk about the conceptual approach. We began this project with a recognition that education has the dual purpose of providing individual and collective goods. This is the rationale for education for democracy in public education and for public education more generally. We've tried to keep these 2 demands balanced. This balance is reflected in the notion that while education focuses on students, those students are participants in the school system. Their participation takes place primarily at the school level and in the classroom, and is mediated to a very large extent by the teacher in that classroom. So there is a nested system within which students' participation and experience operates. Recognizing this, we tried to keep our focus on students as being at the center of this system. Throughout the process of developing this curriculum framework, we've been guided by this systems view on the experience of the child. Let me stay on this slide for a moment to underscore the importance of viewing the child's experience at school in this way. Imagine a child learning in an authoritarian classroom versus an open and participatory classroom. The child in the authoritarian classroom learns, over time, to be quiet, obedient, passive, and complacent. They are suppressed. The child in the open and participatory classroom cultivates a very different way of interacting with the world around them, and this difference has tremendous consequences for the development of citizenship. So, in terms of the approach of the curriculum framework that we were developing, we realized that we also had to consider the assumptions being made and the perspectives taken on teaching and learning, what learning is, and how it takes place. Conventional curriculum development too often takes a reductive perspective in this regard. Despite advances in pedagogy, curriculum development still tends to reflect the simplistic view that teaching is a direct matter of filling students up. This is the conventional approach. But what became clear through our discussions in Mongolia is that learning democracy is not like the learning of science or social studies. The child's learning of citizenship, democracy, and all of the associated values and behaviors that this requires is a matter of a great many influences, not simple didactic teaching. Through our discussion of these many influences, it became evident that learning of content about democracy was only a small part of what mattered. In fact, most of the factors that were involved were conceptual factors. As such, in framing our approach to the curriculum, we couldn't just talk about content the way that most curricula do. We would also have to address students' experiences in school by balancing discussion of content with discussion of the schooling context. It was only in this way that we could go beyond education about democracy to education for democracy. So, with this conceptual approach, we set out to determine our objectives. And again, we began with discussion of conventional approaches. Conventional curricula are usually developed in one of 2 ways, either around a set of contents to be taught or around objectives. When objectives are used, they're typically framed in terms of KSAs, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. But the heavy emphasis is always on knowledge and skills. Attitudes tend to be marginalized, in part because they're hard to teach in the conventional sense. This poses some issues in education for democracy because we are interested in citizenship and engagement in democratic life, and this is hard to articulate through KSAs. In addition, KSAs are all focused on individual learning, but democracy only makes sense as a collective pursuit, and so we wanted to balance individual and collective goods in our approach to the curriculum. So again, our starting point was the individual in society, which is comparable to the student in the school system. And we're interested in transforming students into active democratic citizens. To do this, we outlined 4 domains of objectives. To participate effectively in democratic life, students need a certain base of knowledge, and we created a set of knowledge-based objectives for learning about democracy and the issues relevant to it. And here are those objectives: political systems and government, culture and society, rights and responsibilities, issues and current affairs. There are also important skills particular to democracy and life in democratic societies that students need to develop, things like critical thinking, conflict resolution, and so on. And here are the skills that we concentrated on: critical thinking, systems thinking, critical literacy and communication, working through ambiguity, and conflict resolution. But after this, we broke from the conventional approach of KSAs. In lieu of attitudes, we focused on dispositions, the deeper realm of assumptions, values, perspectives, and importantly, behavioral patterns. Whereas a person can hold a particular attitude but not act on it, dispositions link directly to a person's character and how they interact with the world around them. Additionally, whereas attitudes tend to be marginalized in most curricula, we made dispositions a primary focus. We viewed dispositions as the foundation of democratic participation. And these are the dispositions that we identified: autonomy, a sense of justice and care, integrity, reciprocity, local and global citizenship, reasonableness, mutual civic respect, which we presented in lieu of tolerance, and civic engagement. The challenge with these is that most educational literature doesn't provide clear guidance around how to teach attitudes, let alone dispositions. Educators tend to consider these things as the result of socialization rather than education. But what is the school if not an environment in which socialization takes place? And this led us to the 4th domain of objectives: the school. The school, as a social institution, and in most cases an institution of the state, should also reflect democratic values and principles. So we created a domain of school-level objectives. But these were not only objectives, they were also a means to an end. Students are immersed day after day in the context of their schools. They are conditioned by that context. We realized that if we could succeed in infusing democratic principles into the culture of those schools, then we would in effect be making that socializing environment into an environment which is conducive to the deep learning of democracy. And here are the school-level outcomes that we identified: a sense of connectedness, democratically engaged teachers, school and community partnerships, parental and community involvement, and democratic school governance. So what we ended up with was a curriculum framework with 4 domains of outcomes: knowledge, skills, dispositions, and school outcomes. But we realized that objectives were not enough. We wanted to make this curriculum framework something practical and useful. And to do this, we realized that we needed to provide more depth and detail around how to go about fulfilling these objectives. In doing this, we needed to be careful to keep things general enough to be applicable to all countries, but also specific enough to be useful. We divided our effort into 2 parts: the content and the context of education for democracy. First, the contents. On the content side, we looked first at education about democracy. What things students need to learn about political systems in general and democracy in particular. Unfortunately, this is where many textbooks and curricula on democracy stop. Some have a great deal more depth than what we presented in the framework that we developed. But part of the challenge with this, from our perspective, was that democracies, while sharing many common features and values, are also very different. So we decided that it would be inappropriate in the context of an international framework to be too directive or prescriptive about what democracy is or how exactly it should be practiced. So we kept this section very high level. Nonetheless, learning about democracy on its own is a bit superficial. Democracy is manifested in a relation to issues: social, political, cultural, economic, environmental, and so on. It's in the context of issues like these that democratic engagement takes place. Our first working session in Mongolia generated a long list of such issues. But we realized that most of those issues were highly interrelated. And we wanted to identify the key ones that would transcend borders, cultures, and ideologies, issues which would have both relevance and impact. And importantly, we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to be overburdening teachers. Most curricula are already overstuffed with contents. So for this reason, we wanted to pick on the key issues that would be relatively easy to integrate into existing content matter, and also easy to integrate into the existing subject areas. And these were the final selection. And so for the content of this curriculum framework, we covered two areas: some key points on education about democracy, and a set of important themes and issues. The other part of the curriculum was the context side, looking at how to create an immersive environment for deeper experiential learning of democracy. And for this, we went back to the original list of factors influencing students' learning of democracy at school. We took each of the contextual factors that we identified and elaborated on how they could be adjusted or reoriented to support students' democratic experiences at school. And to make our effort more systematic, we looked at the context in terms of the nested systems that I described earlier. What happens in the classroom is part of the larger context of school life, and the school operates as part of a school system or district. So we classified these factors in order to better describe the real context of students' experiences, and also to make very clear the important roles of educational professionals at all levels of the system. The final step was to put everything together. And we mapped everything onto the very same diagram, and the end result looked like this. This figure summarizes the approach, the content, and the context described in the curriculum framework. It's intended as a kind of lens for looking at education for democracy systematically, helping to demystify the process of teaching it, and providing signposts for how we can work towards tangible outcomes. It contains every major subheading from the curriculum framework that we developed, and visualizes the conceptual approach. So to summarize very briefly, I want to mention what I see as the most distinctive aspects of this model and curriculum framework. First, a balanced focus on content and context of learning. Second, emphasizing dispositions rather than just knowledge and skills. Third, looking at education for democracy as a collective pursuit, not just individual learning. Fourth, providing guidance on how to educate for democracy, not just what to teach. And lastly, to underscore that this approach to education for democracy is entirely consistent with other quality-oriented education reforms. This is not something new and different to do on top of everything else.